Observing your farm, creating a culture of curiosity. A few years ago in Australia, I had an interesting experience while teaching holistic management with friend Brian Welberg. This chicken tractor site looked really compacted, and so I leaned on the penetrometer, and to my surprise, it basically disappeared up to the handle. But what was really interesting was that an inch either side into the green, I couldn't get it to break the soil surface at 600 psi. That was a really stark contrast, and in such a small space. And so the class had a conversation about this and how it related to grazing management with livestock and the impact of dung on soil properties and so on. Really all around how do we create the carbon sponge using livestock. So I came home and I mentioned it to Otago farmer Rick Cameron, and we must have had one hell of a conversation because in 5 minutes he'd bought one and immediately did over 400 probes around the farm. He found that no matter what depth the penetrometer slid to, there was always more grass under the dung. And furthermore, as this picture testifies, he found weeds like thistles reduce compaction. It also got him curious about fertilizer and compaction. Now, it just so happens that Rick happens to have a number of comparison plots on his farm, like this one, where he maintains recommended fertilizer rates. The rest of the paddock doesn't get any fertilizer at all, so that's the control. And the whole paddock just has grazing management with return of dung and urine. And for this site, it's probably been like that way for 10 to 15 years. Here is the penetrometer in a superphosphate plot. And as the figures show, the depth reading for 300 psi is lower than further out in the paddock on the control side. Rick also visited another property, and as you can see, the depth to 300 psi becomes much less depending on the interventions used. Now, I appreciate that the 300 psi is deemed too compact for roots to penetrate, so you could expect that the development of the carbon sponge would be retarded by that. So what does this show? It shows that some standard industry practices compact the soil and therefore reduce its ability to hold moisture and for roots to develop, the deeper carbon sponge. And appreciate that a soil test doesn't show this. Neither does running a plate meter around your pasture. And of course, you can go do this kind of observing with a penetrometer on your own. Okay, you don't need someone over your shoulder. And this is what production economist Barry Riddler means when he says we spend too much time monitoring, not enough time observing. And so imagine if you're seeing these shallow readings, how would that influence the choices you make as a farmer? So let's get back to the idea of dung and its impact on pasture production. And here's a possible example from the high country. On a recent farm tour, right out of the blue, the farmer pulled up to this spot. On the right, a mob of ewes was squeezed onto this postage stamp overnight 6 years ago. It was a one-off event. Nothing like this has been done here since or anywhere else on the property. And as far as I'm aware, there's been no other differences to management between either side of the fence. He was amazed at how long the impact of the event was lasting, but it hadn't triggered his curiosity to look further, or maybe he just didn't know where to start with his questions. So here's a thought. What do you think the rate of return on investment for concentrating dung and urine overnight versus all the other interventions you could possibly buy over a 6-year period be? Would it be substantially competitive? What if they'd done this 200 nights per year over the past 6 years? Would an area 1,200 times the size now be contributing to paying off debts created from all the industry-endorsed improvements on the property? This is the kind of thinking that's missing from farm environment plans. How do we use nature to grow the carbon sponge? So here's my call to action. If your business relies on the carbon sponge, in other words, the soil's ability to absorb moisture rapidly, hold it deeply, and release it through growing plants, what's the next step you're going to take to do some observing on your place? Or if you'd rather do it with a group of friends, let me know.